Barry Siegel. I'm a former Los Angeles Times national correspondent, the author of both novels and nonfiction books, and I now direct the literary journalism program down at UC Irvine, where I'm a professor of English. We'll just go in order here, okay? Tom Hamburger is an investigative reporter for the Los Angeles Times, where he has broken a range of stories examining the influence of corporate interests on government, the role of the White House political office, and the new strategies political parties deploy to win elections. Before joining the Times in 2004, he covered money and politics for the Wall Street Journal, and before that served as Washington bureau chief for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Chris Hedges, next down, was for nearly 2 decades a foreign and war correspondent for the New York Times, the Dallas Morning News, the Christian Science Monitor, and NPR, serving in such places as Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans. He was a member of a team that won the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting for the New York Times, Times' coverage of global terrorism. He received the 2002 Amnesty International Global Award for Human Rights Journalism. He's a senior fellow at the Nation Institute and also teaches in the program for American Studies at Princeton. He's the author of 3 books, the most recent coming out last year, Losing Moses on the Freeway, The 10 Commandments in America. Matt Miller is a Fortune magazine columnist, a commentator for NPR's Morning Edition, the host of the public radio program Left, Right, and Center on KCRW, and a senior fellow for American Progress, a newly launched think tank led by John Podesta, the former White House chief of staff for Bill Clinton. Well, you got to start doing that. His articles have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic Monthly, and many other national publications. A consultant to corporations, nonprofits, and governments, Miller was previously an aide in the Clinton White House and a management consultant with McKinsey & Company. His first book, The 2% Solution, Fixing America's Problems in Ways Liberals and Conservatives Can Love, was published by Public Affairs in fall 2003. And down there at the end is Peter Walston, I'm sorry, it says Peter here. I just said Paul. Is a White House correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, where he has written extensively on the power of the conservative movement and the operations of the White House political machine. Before joining the Times in 2004, he covered Florida politics and Governor Jeb Bush for the Miami Herald and the St. Petersburg Times, and was Washington correspondent for the Charlotte Observer. Tom and Peter together are the co-authors of is it soon to arrive new book, end of June, titled One Party Country, The Republican Plan for Dominance in the 21st Century. So a pretty good crew here to talk about the future of America. What I'd like to do is just start off and invite each of you to tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are on that topic from your particular perspective, what you've been working on or what you will be working on. And we'll start the conversation. Hopefully we can start to maybe get into a discussion back and forth about them. You want to start, Tom?
Sure, Barry. Thank you. Thanks. It's good to be here. Can you hear me okay? Let's see. How do we make this go? How's this?
Yeah.
Is that better? Okay. Let's see, that's a broad question you asked about is it about the future of America, the state of America? Let me tell you what I've been working on with my colleague Peter Walston. Our book, One Party Country, which is coming out at the end of June, looks at the Republican machine that has been built over several decades and that is enhanced dramatically, we argue, during the Bush administration. And the book makes an argument, still relevant, at least we believe, even at a time when it would seem, as it seems to many pundits and maybe to most of you, that the Democrats, and it seems to us too, at least on the face of it, the Democrats should have a lay-down hand in the 2006 midterm elections that are coming up. I mean, the Republicans' most effective leader in Congress, Tom DeLay, has been indicted and resigned. Scooter Libby, hold your applause to the end. Scooter Libby. Scooter Libby, indicted and resigned. Karl Rove, not yet indicted. Has not been indicted, but he's under a cloud. The worst of all for the Republicans and for this administration, it seems, is the news we read every day from Iraq, which is their best-known enterprise and is now a poster child for misjudgment, arguably. We argue the case, though, that despite all of this negative news for the Republicans, the Democrats do not have a lay-down hand. In fact, the odds are against them, even in 2006, even with these dismal poll numbers. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, the Republicans have a secret weapon. I know what it is, the Democrats. In fact, that may be the case, but our argument, in fact, is that there are a series of structural barriers, if you will, structural and strategic protections that the Republican Party has put into place. Some of them may be well known to you. Some we think, and as we started our project, were not so well known to us, but we discovered them along the way. There's a list of about half a dozen of them. They're protections that, despite miserable poll ratings and a spate of bad news affecting at least this administration currently, protects the Republican majorities in Congress, and we think arguably has given them a machinery, structural and strategic advantages, as I mentioned a moment ago, that will keep Republicans, give the Republicans an edge in 2006, and things may not go well for them in 2006, but they'll be in good position in 2008 and thereafter. My colleague and co-author Peter Walston, who's obsessed with sports metaphors, says this is the New York Yankees, or the Duke basketball team. They don't win every game, they don't win every season, but they have an advantage starting out every season. Let me mention just two quickly, and we'll let someone else talk here. One advantage is despite these poll numbers that would suggest presidential approval in the 30s, very high public disapproval of both the administration and the Republicans in Congress, is that the number of competitive seats in Congress is very low. This didn't happen by accident. One of the things that we talk about in the book, One Party Country, is an effort that began by Lee Atwater in the 1980s at the Republican National Committee to form common cause with African American and Latino activists around the country who, of course, were leaning Democratic. And the idea was to control congressional redistricting in a way that would elect more Republicans in the future and that would guarantee safety and reduce the competition in these seats. Our book describes that briefly, and I'll just give you a brief idea of what the idea was, of what Atwater's idea was, and we believe it succeeded. In 1982, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, was amended to encourage more minority representatives in Congress and minority districts. Many Republicans opposed this, but Lee Atwater, who was at the Republican National Committee at the time, saw an opportunity. And the opportunity was to form common cause with Latino and Black and African American leaders around the country and say, let's redistrict. We can increase the number of Latino and African Americans in Congress. But if we draw it right, this will concentrate these voters who are among the Democratic Party's most loyal voters, concentrate them at the heart of districts that will elect minorities. And the adjacent districts, which were once gerrymandered to enjoy support from, could once elect Democrats more dramatically because they drew support from these core Democratic neighborhoods. Let's see, the result would be, and the result was, in fact, in the election of 1992, more minorities elected to Congress than ever before, but also in the adjacent districts, Democrats who had held those seats were losing to Republicans for the first time. It's a redistricting strategy I'm having, and we describe it better in the book than I did just now. But it's an example of how, when you look at what's happening in this country now, you can look at the macro and say, oh, the Republicans are in trouble. But if you look at the micro, you see that it's very difficult to see at the moment how the Republicans will lose control of either the House or the Senate.
Since we're still on your book, let's let Peter jump in also. The Republicans are the Yankees, huh? That's the.
Yeah, I think you can make that argument still legitimately, as Tom said, despite what the poll numbers show. And again, the book does this better than we can sitting here. But I want to give you a few examples of areas that might be of interest to you all. It sounds like from the applause I've been hearing in this room and in other sessions that these audiences are largely maybe troubled by the idea of a long-term Republican majority. But what's very interesting about these structural advantages is the way that the Republican Party has systematically built these structural advantages. These are not coincidental. Some of them go back decades to the creation of think tanks in Washington, such as the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, Cato. Others are more recent creations of this president and his political team, Karl Rove, led by Karl Rove. A few examples, the 2004 campaign was really kind of a culmination of many of these ideas that they had for building this majority. And part of what they saw is they saw that the Democratic Party for decades dominated politics in this country, and that was a vestige of the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt. So they looked at ways to peel off and peel apart that New Deal coalition. And part of what they did was they went after African Americans, and one of the areas that we saw done where they did it so well in '04 was the use of a program in the White House called the Faith-Based Initiative. Many Democrats opposed this program, and it was when Bush first proposed it. Although, in fact, President Clinton and also Al Gore had supported charitable choice and did support the use of federal dollars for religious charities. What President Bush did was turn this into much more of a political weapon. And what they did is they directed millions of dollars to African American and Latino churches that turned around and whose pastors became supporters of the president. It was a very smart. It was outrageous to some, but it was, from a political standpoint, a very smart use of a government program. There's a number of examples that we detail in the book, in One Party Country, that are similar, that show you how they used the machinery of government to turn a political advantage. The faith-based initiative was actually that was a story. I was in an African American church in Milwaukee during the campaign, and it was that experience where when I first came across the faith-based initiative, and that was part of what motivated us to write this book. And there were other examples of them peeling away groups that are so closely associated with Democratic dominance. Another example, and then I'll let others talk, but was the Republican efforts to segment and go after the Jewish vote. Again, not a huge vote nationally, but in certain key states, battleground states, Florida, for example, where as we saw in 2000, every vote can count. Michigan as well, and even Ohio. The Republicans figured out that certain kinds of Jewish voters were more likely to be convinced to vote Republican. Orthodox Jews, even some conservative Jews. The war in Iraq, a lot of single-issue pro-Israel Jews might be motivated to vote Republican. And so they went about and they found these Jews. And a good example was we found in Cleveland Heights, a neighborhood of a lot of Russian Orthodox Jews. The Bush campaign went there and they used, for those of you familiar with Orthodox Judaism, they have in every community a mikvah list, which is a list of the whole Jewish community for purposes of social services and babysitting and community events. They actually turned the mikvah list into a voter database. They also convinced the local rebbes to issue what, I probably shouldn't use this word, but in a sense was a religious fatwa to vote on election day. And they told not just the men, but the women to vote. And the yeshivas had election day off so the girls could babysit, so the women could go vote. And they also held, on the final days of the campaign, an entire Bush campaign rally in Russian. Which was for the people we spoke to who were there, was a pretty remarkable event, and it was the first time in their memory that a Republican political event had been carried out in Russian. Now, there Russian Jews in New York City have been political players, but this was one of the first times that we encountered kind of the tapping into that community outside of New York City. Those are a couple examples, and I'm sure we'll talk more.
Well, okay, we've got envisioning the future, we've got possibly a one-party country. I know that Chris Hedges is looking down in the future, is also thinking about the growing power of the Christian right. In fact, isn't in the fall you've got another book coming out, right?
Yes.
American Fascism, the Christian Right, and the War on America. Well, tell us, what is your, go ahead, man.
Well, that's what I've spent the last year and a half or so doing is traveling to Christian right events and interviewing people within the movement. And I think that it's interesting to watch the troubles within the Republican Party, which in many ways is imploding, which has been the main vehicle for the Christian right in their efforts to take power. There's a great deal of dissatisfaction within the Christian right with the Bush administration now, a feeling or a fear on the part of many of the leaders of the Christian right, including Bob Jones and others, Dobson, who worry that once again they've been had, that the Republican Party has made all sorts of promises to them to carry out their core agenda, of course banning abortion, putting prayer back in schools, these sort of moral hot-button issues that have mobilized their base. So this uneasy relationship is fascinating to watch, and it's of course being played out and will be played out tomorrow with the issue of immigration. The radical leaders of the Christian right are strong supporters of bills that would essentially expel immigrants and make it a federal or a felony to assist illegal immigrants, whereas the corporate sponsors, who they have made an alliance with, and of course it's that mixture of the Christian right and corporations that define the Bush administration, of course want cheap labor. They want, and that's a really interesting phenomena to watch. So there's an uneasy tension within the movement, and the Christian right, of course, is not monolithic, but I think that's a good demonstration that neither is the Republican Party. I think that this movement, the radical Christian right, people we call Christian Reconstructionists or Christian Dominionists, those who would like to create a Christian state. They would like an amendment within the Constitution that defines our country as a Christian nation. They would like to strip down the federal government to be responsible essentially for homeland security, defense, and property rights and nothing else. All social services would be turned over to evangelical churches who would administer everything from drug rehabilitation clinics to schools with, of course, the possibility of proselytizing. And we see much of that coming to play in the faith-based initiative that Peter mentioned, where we are giving tax dollars to groups that will not hire Jews, will not hire Muslims, will not hire atheists, will not hire people who they don't define as Bible-believing Christians. And I think that there's a kind of huge shift within American society that those of us who are removed from those pockets perhaps don't quite understand and glimpse with a kind of disbelief and I think puzzlement. Why, to those of us who believe in rational thought, who believe in intellectual honesty, who believe in science, why would you want to establish in public school systems the teaching of creationism? I mean, the writers of the book of Genesis, after all, thought the earth was flat. And I think that what this movement is built on is a profound despair that has gripped especially the working class in this country. Remember, there are 47 million full-time workers in the United States who make less than $10 an hour. The levels of poverty, even in California, if you look in 1980, those children in this state who were living in poverty, it was 15.2%. It is now 25.1%. And remember that the official level of poverty is $17,200 a year for a family of four. That's before deductions and before the cost of getting to work, etc. There is, of course, no family that is going to exist. If you add into that, if you factor into that levels of near poverty, probably 46% of the children in this state are in that category. And this is replicated around the country. I spent a lot of time in Ohio, as I think both Tom and Peter did, and they can tell you as well as I do that you get up to places like Youngstown, and these are just absolutely devastated, former manufacturing centers. And I think that this movement is playing off of the rage of tens of millions of Americans in this country who have been completely disenfranchised by the system. And it's extremely volatile. They have been sucked into a movement that is not reality-based. They believe in magic. They believe that Jesus intervenes in their life on a daily basis and can heal them and has a plan for them. And the theology that they embrace and promote is essentially one of profound despair, because it is wrapped around this grim apocalyptic vision where everything on the planet will be destroyed, everything that has betrayed them, everything that they hate, and they alone, it's a kind of spiritual Darwinism, will be lifted up into heaven, and the rest of us will be incinerated with horrific torment. And I think that there is a psychological malaise or a psychological underpinning to this belief system that we have to begin to confront if we're going to confront the rise of this very radical movement that has as its goal the destruction of our open society.
Okay, so now we've got a one-party country and a radical Christian right in charge. Matt, what do you got for us? I know you're concerned, one thing you're concerned about, I don't want to lead you, you can actually give us anything you want, but I know you're concerned to some extent about the future of capitalism in the country and the future of the American model. So,
well, you teed up a lot of things, Chris, I hope we'll get to in conversation, but let me give my own spiel first. I guess when I think about the future of the country, the first thing I do is I want to close my eyes and just wish it's 2.5 years from now, because I don't think the real debate will start on this until the 2008 campaign. I think that while 2006 will be interesting, it'll be interesting to see, I'm hopeful as a Democrat that Democrats gain seats, but I think the kinds of macro issues that matter in sort of shaping the trajectory of the country only are presidential level issues and will only get resonance and voice in a presidential campaign. And if we had a parliamentary system, I think this crowd would have gotten a vote of no confidence, not a little bit of a while ago, and we'd have a change in government now. But we really, I don't know if others feel this way, you're sort of stuck in this situation where we got to wait another couple of years until we get another presidential campaign and can revisit some of the basic direction that we have. So that's sort of point one. If you look at the 2008 campaign, I think it's wide open in a lot of ways. I mean, the Republican field is going to be wide open in ways it hasn't been in, I don't know how long when. On the Democratic side, obviously Mrs. Clinton has a sort of presumptive lock, certainly on the donations and the political talent, and we can talk about that in Q&A. But I think the issues, there's going to be a chance to have a real debate again in a way that we haven't had in a long time. And as we approach that moment, I guess the most interesting thing to me right now is how alienated most Americans feel from both major parties. Even though the polls show the Democrats way ahead as we head toward the midterm elections, and the Republicans, as Tom said, in terrible shape, a president in the low 30s, it couldn't get worse than that. They're not saying that they find Democrats an appealing alternative at all. And the fastest growing party right now is people who identify themselves as no party or independents. And I think that suggests or reflects this kind of, I don't know if people would articulate it this way, but that most people know that what they're getting from the current crop in power, as well as what the Democrats are talking about in opposition, aren't equal to the challenges that the country faces. So that's sort of the political terrain. Substantively, I think there's a reason for this kind of public alienation and sort of official confusion by both parties, which is, not to be too grand about it, but I think we're at an interesting new inflection point in the history of American capitalism. We are about to undergo, and I think this is true not just for the U.S., but for the wealthy nations more broadly, perhaps the severest test capitalism has faced in nearly a century since the New Deal, since the Great Depression and the New Deal. And I think no one, least of all today's capitalists, have any idea of what to do about it. I see four forces at work that are shaping where we're headed. One, as everyone knows, is globalization, but the main piece of it is the fact that because of the dramatic shrinking of communications costs and the advance of technology, the ability for jobs to be done overseas at very distant places now is going to affect not just manufacturing and traditional blue-collar jobs, but increasingly jobs that go up the income scale. Alan Blinder, who was one of the key economic advisors to President Clinton, did a big piece in Foreign Affairs a month or so ago saying that as many as 40 to 50 million jobs could be affected by this new ability to outsource or to source labor from different places in the world. And I think we have about 140 million jobs today in the American economy. So if you're talking about 40 to 50 million potentially being exposed to risk, and I don't want to be a Cassandra or a doomsayer, we don't know how far that will go, but that's a different thing than previous eras of globalization 100 years ago, and a different dynamic for both everyone's lives and for politics than just a smaller group who are unskilled, who've been traditionally affected by what can be outsourced. So that's force one. Force two is, given these dynamics, you've got corporate America in a situation where it feels a strong desire to get out of the healthcare and pension business. And our welfare state is kind of anomalous compared to the rest of the world in that we've provided health care basically through large companies. That system, I would say, is really at risk, not sustainable, probably was, it was a historical accident that had happened in the first place after World War II in ways we can talk about if you want. But companies, for reasons that are not that they're evil and big bad companies, but because all the companies they compete with around the world don't bear, as GM does, $1,500 per car in healthcare costs. Starbucks is raising, Howard Schultz told me the other day for a column, it raised the price of lattes, you know, from $4 to $4.25, largely because of healthcare costs. Now, that works at Starbucks because it's got a customer base that can afford to pay an extra quarter for a latte and therefore subsidize nice health care for 100,000 Starbucks workers in the U.S., but not every company, obviously, can make the math work when they're, you know, because not everyone's got products where people can pay $4.50 for a cup of coffee. So, again, the healthcare system today is putting corporations under strain. At the same time, the third force is that the aging population, not just here but in the other advanced nations, is putting tremendous stress on public budgets. So at the time that companies feel a need to get out of some of the healthcare and pension side of things, the government is about to be totally gobbled up by healthcare and pensions in ways that makes it very hard and in fact unthinkable at current levels of taxation to take on many added burdens as companies are sort of getting out of the business of doing some of this stuff. And then finally, and this is sort of, I haven't fully wrapped my mind around this, but there is the inequality factor. And look, inequality has always been with us in capitalist system, but there's something new going on now. The levels of CEO pay in this country are reaching levels that are so divorced from performance and so divorced from sort of any sort of common sense sense of reality, and the gap between what happens at a very small strata at the top and the vast swath of Americans, many of whom are going to be in this 40 to 50 million we're talking about, potentially being at risk, it just raises questions about the coherence of a democracy when you've got a very thin layer constantly doing better and more folks feeling stressed. It's not just here. China feels the same thing. I talked to a Chinese official the other day asking them, what's your biggest worry about the reforms you're going through now? And his answer was not the incredible structural reforms they have to go to because their banking system's a mess. You know, they've got all these state-owned enterprises. They're trying to transition to an economy that will be more productive, and they've done more in the last 10 or 15 years to bring human beings out of poverty than at any time in human history. But his biggest worry is the inequality between the very wealthy coast, the Shanghai, you know, the coastal area where there are millionaires and Gucci stores opening up, et cetera, and the deep rural provinces where you've still got several 100 million people who haven't benefited at all from the boom that China's been undergoing for 2 decades, and in many ways, because their health system is very screwed up in the rural area, they're actually worse. So inequality is sort of the last factor. And I guess all of this is going to place stress on our on our current model, and it's going to force a rethinking of our current social arrangements in American capitalism. I think the big need is that we're going to have to find new ways to rebalance the risk that capitalism inevitably brings in a market-based system with the security that people crave and the decent life that a society as wealthy as ours ought to be able to create. And we're going to have to find new models to do that aren't based on putting it all on corporations, aren't based on putting it necessarily all on government in traditional ways, but finding answers that combine market forces and public purposes in ways that will set us on a kind of new path for the 21st century. And we can talk more about it, I guess, as we tee it up in Q&A, but I think somehow we're struggling toward what I'm thinking of as a kind of a capitalism 4.0 to be born here. The first phase being sort of in the beginning of industrial age to the early 19th or early 20th century, sort of industry booms, and then you have lots of excesses, and Charles Dickens talking about the dark satanic mills. Phase two was sort of the whole period through the 20th century where you had these forces for equity trying to go against the forces of just pure markets, giving us progressive movement, the New Deal, the Great Society, a backlash against that since the 70s with Reagan, Thatcher, et cetera. And now we're on the threshold of this fourth phase where the old models aren't going to work, and we're going to have to find both a new politics that lets us have this discussion and also a new form of public policy that lets us update these old, really timeless concerns in a way that keeps our country competitive in a global economy.
Thank you, guys. I'd like to invite you to sort of discuss each other's ideas, but let me start with one question that maybe all of you might consider, if not answer. Do you think we need a third party?
What, you want me to?
All of you, whoever wants to grab the mic, you're all on now at the same time. Get competitive.
Well, I guess, I mean, I'm a Democrat, but I've always been vulnerable to third-party temptation just because I'm frustrated with Democrats' ability to lay out a vision, I think, that's equal to what the challenges are today. I'm hoping Democrats, and I hope in 2008, whether it's Mrs. Clinton or others, will be equal to that. I guess I think that if it doesn't happen this election, and if the Republicans can continue to veer right, and Democrats end up in what I think of as a kind of reactionary liberalism, then I think there will be a new kind of, echo of a Ross Perot-style movement. Maybe not, with Perot himself, obviously, but I think the U.S. economy generates enough high net worth patriots to fund what it takes to fund, and it's a lot, some kind of new force that would probably be co-opted by one of the parties, because that's what tends to happen in American history. Richard Hofstadter has this great line that the role of third parties is to sting like a bee and then die. And it's true. I mean, what Perot did in '92, I thought he did a tremendous public service. It totally changed what we did in the Clinton administration in the first year on the budget, because he proved that 20% of the public would vote for somebody who was up there with the charts and the graphs talking about how we couldn't go on this way, being fiscally irresponsible. So I would like to see Democrats find the right path on this, but I think we may need a third force if 08 doesn't end up promising.
I think Matt makes a good point. I mean, if we didn't have Eugene Debs, we would have never had the New Deal. What we're creating in American society is an oligarchy. I mean, America in some ways is turning into a third world nation. We now live in a country where the top 1% of the richest people have financial wealth equal to the combined 95% of the population. If this continues, it's not going to have simply social ramifications, but political ramifications as well, especially as corporate interests, as Tom and Peter, through the Republican Party, have pointed out, rig the system, and these well-funded mass movements that are really about the sanctification of rage and exclusion and an expression of hate at their core gain momentum, and they will gain momentum as things get worse. I mean, if the housing bubble bursts, if we suffer another catastrophic terrorist attack, and having spent a year of my life covering Al-Qaeda for the New York Times, there was not an intelligence official I interviewed who didn't think it was inevitable. It was always a question of when, not if. And I think we always have to factor in that possibility. Having lived through the beginning of the suicide bombings in Israel, I've seen what happens when a populace suddenly becomes terrified and afraid. And we are far more coddled than most Israelis. There are many people in the administration who have worked overtime since 9/11 to make us afraid, and nothing, of course, has happened on American soil since 9/11. But give them the tools to work with. And I think that we could, in a very short time, see a system that has been weakened through a series of forces. The thing that frightens me the most is that, you know, we went through a period like this in the 1930s, and there was a flirtation by many American capitalists with fascism. Fortune magazine in, I think, 1934 published a cover story on Mussolini that lauded his ability to defang labor unions and free large corporations to function. But there were powerful progressive forces in the country, especially through the labor unions. Those forces are gone now. The press has been corporatized. Less than 10% of American workers are unionized. And I don't see the breaks that we had in the 1930s. So that if we enter a period of crisis, which, you know, we could enter a period of crisis just on the mismanagement of the economy alone, I wonder where those third-party forces or those progressive forces that, while they may not have assumed power, have helped shape the social agenda, helped give us things like Social Security. And I don't know where those forces are going to come from.
Tom wants to jump in here.
Peter had told me that Gore Vidal was asked yesterday about the third party, whether a third party is necessary, and he said, well, don't we need to have a second, do we have a second party? And that's a question I did want to throw to Matt, self-identified Democrat here, and someone who has done in his book 2% Solution some original thinking and offered some new ideas. You laid out, and Chris just referred a moment ago to some serious problems that could be facing this country. You talked about the kind of economic calamity we could face. Matt, you mentioned health care, outsourcing, pensions. If we go down that list, where is the Democratic Party on those topics? Because what I'd argue is that the Republican Party at least can offer this, an answer. We may disagree with it, but it is at least possible for us to describe something coherent that the party stands for or believes, or an approach that they would provide. Are the Democrats able to answer on any of the four biggies that you mentioned?
I guess I think yes. But first I should say, I don't think we're headed toward a calamity like the one Chris would, I think, mention. I mean, the Depression was, 25% of the country unemployed for a long period of time. I don't think we're facing something like that. And I think we know a lot better how to manage the macroeconomy than we did then. There were a lot of big errors then that made, the stock market crash much worse. So I think that's good news. It doesn't mean we're not going to have potential trouble, and in particular, the standard of living, the traditional standard of living for a lot of folks moving up the income scale more than it has in the past, being threatened.
Outsourcing 50 million jobs could
well,
have serious
if it ends up,
repercussions.
yes, if it ends up being that. And I said I don't want to say that those are numbers that are being bandied about. That doesn't mean it's true yet. So, but it's a threat. I guess I think the Democrats do have. I mean, the Democrats want health care. I hope that Mrs. Clinton will be talking about health care for everyone in the next election. I think Republicans know it's sufficiently an issue that they will be talking about much bigger expansions of health care with their 2008 candidates as well. Even in spite of what John McCain is doing these days, I think when he's running toward the center sometime closer to the next campaign, he'll be aiming higher on health care, and so will some of the other folks.
Mitt Romney, maybe.
Mitt Romney, right, exactly. And the Democrats want decent pensions. My quarrel with the Democrats, or with folks in my party, is that if you add up the wish list, the traditional progressive wish list of even fuller prescription drugs for Medicare than what the Republicans did a down payment on, universal health coverage, a bolstered Social Security system, much more investment in education for poor kids in particular, I think, and in teachers for poor kids. If you add it all up, it would take taxes as a share of GDP, as a share of the size of the economy, so much higher than we've ever had in the country, and so much higher than you can make an argument would be good for the economy. The Democrats don't want to face the idea that we may need to rethink the way we do Medicare and Social Security for this new era, which I think we do. And so I think the Democrats' values are in the right place. I think we end up in this weird situation where a lot of folks have to decide, is it easier to teach the Democrats economics or the Republicans decency? And I think that's that shouldn't have to be our only choice, I guess.
You know,
And
the
that's
Democrats, though, Matt, are vulnerable on this because I'm not sure. You mentioned universal health care as something that all the Democrats agree on. I'm not sure that's true, that every Democratic candidate agrees on universal health care. At least they're afraid of being tagged with that because the Republicans have managed to define that in a certain way. And also,
That's why, by the way, what Mitt Romney just did in Massachusetts is so helpful, because he's the Republican governor there who just passed, with a Democratic legislature, with Ted Kennedy's support, a plan that would, over several years, they argue, get to universal in a different way. And I have some questions about whether that'll happen, but that's an enormous marker for the GOP and could change the polls of debate. Sorry.
No, that's okay. And the other point, you mentioned how Democrats tend to support better education for poor kids. That may be true, but again, here is where the Republicans have found a way to create doubt in the minds of many people, because if you look at the debate over school vouchers, that's a debate that Republicans are supporting taxpayer dollars for private education. And most of those programs are created in inner cities, which are populated by African Americans. And many of the people who have benefited, at least many of the people who the Republicans claim will benefit or would benefit from voucher programs, are black kids. And it's the Democrats, largely because of the power of the teachers' unions in that party, that have opposed vouchers. So here you have an issue where Republicans are able to go to the inner cities, and Republicans can go to these churches, again, in part through the faith-based initiative, but other programs, and they can talk about how, in fact, it's Republicans who have done more for poor kids. And that's an area that many Democrats are very uncomfortable.
I think that's a great point, and one I'm sure you'll hear more about in the new book, One Party Dominance. I promised I would plug their book at every opportunity, because it is going to be great. But I agree with you. I mean, but I think, and that's part of what I mean when I say the Democrats fall into this reactionary liberalism, because I think you're totally right. I mean, I'm a liberal who is pro bigger voucher trials. I think we should try vouchers in some places. I don't think it's a panacea, but I think it's wrong when the only thing a Democratic Party can go to a family with kids in kindergarten, a Latino family in L.A. Or New York, and say, sit tight, we've got a 10 or 15-year reform plan. I don't think that's a sufficient answer. And I think you need, if you spend any time in urban school systems, as I have, you need both serious top-down reforms, and you need some kind of from the bottom bubbling up choice or competition that'll help shake up what can be very calcified bureaucracies. And the teachers' unions, and I'm friendly with many teachers, I'm friendly with a number of union leaders, but there are ways in which they have requirements that I think make it impossible for Democrats to serve their constituents, low-income, poor kids, at the expense of their biggest interest group, because the unions today send more folks to the Democratic Convention than the state of California. So I think those are huge problems and contribute to my worry that Democrats can't ever craft an agenda that's going to be actually equal to some of the problems.
I just, you mentioned the problem with the Democrats and economics, and, to fund the social programs would require raising taxes. But the Democrats no longer raise the issue of the fact that half of all tax dollars go into defense, into the military. That, we spend $60 billion on a missile defense system that doesn't work. We spend $2 billion to build B-2 bombers that most people in the Pentagon don't even want. And it used to be, in the old days, that there would be Democratic senators who would investigate this huge dumping of American tax dollars into the Pentagon and challenge particular defense systems, missile systems. It's all gone. There is a complete acceptance on the part of the Democratic Party, as there is within the Republican Party, of everything these huge corporations want, because they're funding both parties. And I think that we have to address the fact that the political system has become hostage to these corporate interests. And we know it because on those issues they won't challenge it. And when they get up and tell you, we can't fund universal health care, we can't go in and fix inner city public schools because it would require paying taxes, they don't address the fact that, how much was it for a hammer that they had to $450? Remember? But it's a small anecdotal story, but we're talking about, I don't know, hundreds of millions of dollars in just sheer waste of American taxpayers' dollars.
Can I toss in one point to that? I agree with you and I disagree with you. I agree with you that it is incredibly wrong that during the biggest military buildup maybe in the nation's history since Bush took office, when it's gone from around $300 billion to close to $500 billion per year, the fact that there hasn't been investigation when you know there's, in any ramp up like that, there's enormous waste and enormous abuse, et cetera, is wrong, and Democrats should have been all over it, like Harry Truman was even during World War II when he actually made his name as a senator and got on the cover of Time magazine for leading that kind of look into the industrial, military-industrial complex, even during a time of massive war in a way that was harder, arguably, than it should be today. But I have to say, I think you're wrong just in terms of the facts. The idea that we could fund what we need to fund for if progressives think you could fund the progressive agenda simply by cutting military spending, I believe that's factually wrong. The military spending is about $500 billion a year. The federal budget's around $2.2 trillion now. You can't cut defense enough to fund all of this. So even if we could agree you could trim defense, you can't deal with the aging of the baby boom and what that's going to do to Social Security and Medicare, adding 45 or 50 million people who are uninsured to the rolls of the uninsured, recruiting a new generation of teachers, spending a lot more, I think, on subsidized wages for low-income people, which we'll need to do as more folks become at risk. I think you can't do it through that alone, and it's and I just think we need to be honest about that.
I think Matt's exactly right. My point was that they won't even challenge them. I mean, I think that's a huge window into who controls them when they won't even raise the questions that should be raised on behalf of the American public.
And the reason that happens, I believe, is because Democrats are in such a weak position on national security, and our party's image is so bad on national security that all talk of cutting defense becomes the proxy during campaigns for are you tough enough to lead the country in an age of terror, and they are mortified. I mean, that's what the politicians will say privately. Yes, we should revisit this, but unless you're Bob Kerrey, or somebody who's got an impeccable military background, and even John Kerry's turned out to be not immune to, being swift-boated, which seems, amazing still in retrospect. Democrats feel absolutely paralyzed in the soundbite nature of the modern political campaign to talk about that kind of stuff in a way that lets them be branded soft on defense.
But
it's
let's
a problem, you're right.
Let's also be clear that they're getting money from these people, and big money, too.
Let's let the audience join in, too. We've got microphones on both sides here. Let's you get involved with questions and answers, because we've got about 10, 12 minutes to go. Are the microphones both on there? Go ahead.
One thing that I expected to come up in this discussion but didn't was the nature of the tax base itself. Back in the 1950s, corporations paid 24% of all federal tax revenues. Now it's 7%. That's a pretty dramatic decline. I was wondering, especially for Matt and Chris, the people who have talked about these problems, how much of these problems of poverty, the fundamental malaise that was being discussed, the disparity between the middle class and the elites, the whole oligarchy thing, how much of that do you think could be solved, if it were possible even, by restructuring the tax base to benefit more of the middle class, like was the case back several decades ago?
I think that that's a huge and important step. I think, as Matt pointed out, there isn't one easy solution, but certainly creating a more equitable tax system. And what we've seen since the Reagan administration, but certainly accelerated with this administration, is that, that old adage that whatever is good for ExxonMobil or Halliburton is good for America, and the rest of us be damned. And I think that, until we begin to bring people into the Congress and into the federal government that again are willing to stand up for the taxpayer and stand up for the person who isn't a corporation. I mean, corporations are given the same legal rights as individuals. I don't need to spell out the whole Enron scandal, but go back and look at the savings and loans bailout. I mean, this is just, ever since the deregulation under the Reagan years, and it's only, of course, accelerated under this administration, these corporations have essentially have the country hostage. And they, in a very pernicious and cynical way, I think, use the Christian right to essentially further this agenda. That is their grassroots movement. And this unholy alliance is one that's deeply disturbing to the country. But I think taxation is a big issue.
Just briefly, is there a second? And I say this as a Democrat to a room mostly of Democrats, I think. I don't think returning to those levels of corporate taxation makes economic sense. I think it's appealing in a populist sense, but I think corporations those taxes are paid by the shareholders, which are people as well as major institutions and largely the pension funds that all of us rely on for our retirement. And I think we'd be better off raising taxes on things like energy to force the kind. I mean, I think gas prices should be higher, and that's, I'm sure, another very unpopular thing to say. And there are ways to do that and still offset it, the impact of it on low-income people. But until we have higher gas prices for a long time, we will never change the kind of automobiles and fuel efficiency that we have. It's just the only way. And everybody else knows it. Tony Blair came a few years ago and said it's, you know, it's hard to worry about a country who could solve a lot of its problems with an extra buck on a gas tax. You know, he also knows it's easy to say that when you're visiting from another country and don't understand the political dynamics here. But I would be raising taxes on energy, things we want to conserve, and actually making our companies more competitive globally and not put them at tax disadvantages in that way, and still try and cut, say, payroll taxes on the middle class, because that's a job-killing tax.
Let's go. Yeah.
How much would it cost for the American people to buy back their government?
Does everyone just we'll call that a comment?
A rhetorical question.
Rhetorical question. Okay.
What I want to know is how can we possibly ever have any kind of a change of, let's call it regime, when we can't have an honest election? Or do we need a new system of voting?
Well, I don't know if you're referring to the 2000 election or to the questions about the voting machines or to the
All of the above?
or to the system in general. I mean, all of the, you know, that's a hard question to answer. I mean, part of the reality of the Electoral College map that one of the issues that we explore is that it just, the nature of the Electoral College map right now benefits Republicans.
Address the issues of actually getting an appropriate count, or people being able to get to the polls.
Well,
any of the other things that were methods that were used to fix most elections.
you know, part of the issue in 2000, of course, many argued that Al Gore may have made some the Gore campaign may have made some mistakes in their legal approach to that. And as far as Ohio, you know, there was a lot of controversy. I'm not sure I ever saw any proof that the potential problems in voting in Ohio would have led to a difference in the outcome.
Let's always remember that, I mean, the Electoral College is a huge problem. Gore won the popular vote by 500,000 votes. And addressing that Electoral College, as well as the fact that, you know, the disparity in terms of population or representation within the Senate, where you have huge population senators like New York State or California with 2 senators, and other states with very sparse population. I mean, there is restructuring in a way that we can more adequately express the popular will through the electoral process. I mean, there is important electoral reform that needs to be done. I think the Electoral College, you know, certainly in Europe, we're sort of the laughingstock of any democracy. It doesn't make any sense when a candidate wins the popular vote by that much and isn't president. It wouldn't happen in any other democracy that I know.
It was very important for the Bush campaign to win the popular vote in 2004. So so a lot of what there's kind of machinery that they created, they went out and they found voters where voters had not been found before, and they did this in I guess you could take that 2 ways, but they went out and they found Republican voters in big cities, and they found as well as the rural areas and the kind of ex-urban areas that traditionally benefit them. So what they did, you know, the Democrats used to be better at grassroots politics. It used to be the power of the Democratic Party and the labor movement to get voters to the polls, to find them, to motivate them, to get them out. You know what? The Republicans did that better this time. So there were a lot of allegations of irregularities and voter fraud, but the truth of the matter is that the Republicans did a better job in 2004 than the Democrats did in getting voters to the polls. And the Democrats can win elections again, but they're going to have to figure out a way to motivate voters and get them to the polls the way the Republicans have done. And they've done this through technology and sophistication, the likes of which the Democrats just don't have right now.
Just 1 nanosecond on top of that, just to build on what Peter said. I gave a talk at to some policy folks and political folks at 10 Downing Street in London about 2 months ago, and one of the things that was most surprising, but then not surprising to me, is building on what Peter says, is because of the, they went to school on what Clinton did back in '92, and there's always been a close sort of relationship between the Blairites and the kind of Clinton and the Democratic Party, and but they were, because of the good relations they have with the Bush White House because of Iraq and Blair's positions on Iraq, they have been using that as a way they're sending people over to study the way Rove and the Republicans do the electioneering because they think they're so good at it and so ahead of the Democratic side on this, which was stunning to me for a second and then makes perfect sense if you're just trying to update your own state of the art in terms of winning elections.
You should see the voter database the Republicans use. I mean, I wish we could see the whole voter database they use. It's more impressive than probably we even realize. But the Democrats are way behind on that. And so when you're concerned about voter irregularities and voter fraud determining the outcome of an election, you probably don't want the election to be that close to begin with.
Let's see if we can get one or two questions in. Let's go.
I wonder if you could comment on the role of or the disappearance of the media in today's political spectrum. I mean, ever since Dan Rather's escapade with Bush's voting record, it seems that the media has retreated from exposing a lot of the things that you're talking about here. I mean, the last election, we had all these orange alerts and yellow alerts. As soon as the election was over, there's no alerts. The whole thing disappeared. There's so many situations like that where I don't see it being printed in the paper. I don't hear it on the radio. I don't hear anybody in the media really talking about, all the injustices going on.
Well, I mean, I guess there's a lot of frustration. It seems to be a theme I've heard in a lot of sessions. No matter what the topic is, everyone wants to know why the media is screwing this up or that up. And there's a lot of frustration, but I have to remind you that a lot of what everyone knows about what's going wrong has been reported in the newspapers. I mean, the Washington Post did win a Pulitzer Prize for exposing the CIA prisons, and the New York Times won a Pulitzer for the NSA stories. I mean, a lot of these things are being reported, and I think that what we have, the media can and should be aggressive, maybe more aggressive.
Let me just add, I think that unfortunately, especially with the sort of the revolution that's happening within the media through the internet and through the struggling, we see it every day played out in newspapers. It's even been played out in the LA Times, of course, is that there has been a kind of response on the part of the media to placate their elite, their advertising elite, so that we are. I think that there are huge sections of this country who have become virtually invisible. It used to be that newspapers would really cover labor, cover the inner city. We may see those people in a series or in an occasional article, but I think their voices now are almost never heard. And I think that's really hurt the media a lot. I think we have become, when they criticize us for being elitist, I think that is true. I think, as Peter pointed out, the reporting, especially on the erosion of civil liberties and the war in Iraq, has gotten better, but a lot of that came out of deep soul searching on the part of the media that acted as cheerleaders for the war. And many of the questions that they're asking now could have been asked before and were not. So I think that there's a real crisis within most newspapers and most media organizations. And let me just put a plug for great newspapers like the LA Times and the Washington Post and the New York Times that still try and do journalism, because as far as I can tell, broadcast media or television has given up. There's virtually no journalism done, or very little anymore.
I just want to follow up with one quick point. I know we're running out of time, but it's this. In response to the earlier question, I think certainly that news organizations need to be more aggressive. There has been the kind of soul-searching that Chris talked about after the sort of rise of patriotic response after 9/11, I think did produce too much acquiescence, I guess you might call it, and not enough tough questioning. But there is also, I'd argue, we can come back to this later, a war on the press, a war on openness that's going on in Washington right now. And the two cases that were just mentioned, well, the NSA spying story and the reporter at the Washington Post who won the Pulitzer for exposing CIA prisons overseas, are both having to retain huge, their news organization incurring huge legal bills because they're concerned they are going to be dragged into court and required to reveal their sources. And their sources, or potential sources, those who talk to the press and get important stories like this to the public, are facing unprecedented pressures, including polygraphs, the equivalent of loyalty oaths. The war on the press is another topic we should keep in mind.
And to add to that point is that there's been a lot of reporters will be submitting Freedom of Information Act requests to try to, as Tom has a lot, to try to learn what's going on, and a lot the administration finds unique and clever ways to reject many of those.
Amen, Tom. Amen, Peter. I agree with that totally. I hate to do this. We're having a great conversation. I know we've got great questions still to be answered, but we have run out of time. Thank you very much.